Highbridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Cobbler, How I Disrupted an Industry, Fell from Grace, and Came Back Stronger Than Ever, by Steve Madden. Read by Steve Madden. For my brother Luke, who inspired and influenced me in so many ways, I love you. If you're going through hell, keep going. Attributed to Winston Churchill. Introduction. I fidgeted in my tux, restless as ever, as the supermodel Winnie Harlow stood on stage talking about my career, my brand, and me. These events always felt surreal. I never got used to them, and it was hard to focus on what she was saying as thoughts flooded through my brain. Is my jacket straight? Do I have all the notes for my speech? It's nice that Winnie is wearing a pair of my shoes. Steve Madden has been called many things, Winnie said from the podium. That's for sure, I thought. Mogul, she said, pausing for effect. Icon. I could have added to that list. As a kid, I was called things like stupid and lazy, a pain in the ass who couldn't shut up and sit still. Nobody knew then that I had an attention disorder that kept me from focusing, or that such a thing even existed. In my teens and 20s, I was called other things, a partier, a wild man. But at the height of my addiction, when I was either out crashing cars or hiding in my apartment, isolating myself from the world, my life was anything but a party. It wasn't until I turned 30 and got clean that people started calling me things that were positive, creative, charismatic, someone who was on the pulse of trends and knew how to create a cool product for a good price. When I look back, those years were the best. Hustling and fighting, clawing my way to the top of an industry that was loath to accept an outsider like me. But they were also the years when I made my biggest mistakes, fueled by impatience and a replacement addiction, money. After my downfall, the names I was called were the most hurtful, even though they were true. A criminal, a convict, a mere number as far as anyone running the facility I was locked up in cared to know. And now, years later, here I was in a fancy ballroom, wearing a tuxedo, and receiving an award for creating a multi-billion-dollar global brand. Looking back at both the past 30 years and that last sentence, it seems like nothing more than an illusion, a random twist of fate that landed me here. But can life possibly be that cruel? And tonight, Winnie said with a big smile, turning to the spot where I stood off stage, we add visionary to that list. I walked onto the stage, and she presented me with a small figurine of a clutch covered in Swarovski crystals, the Accessory Council's Visionary Award. The rest of the night was a blur of mingling and congratulations. A few hours later, it was a relief to be home on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. On a clear day, I can see from my apartment over the bridge to Queens, New York, where I was born. My family soon moved a stone's throw away to the Five Towns of Long Island, a place that is still very much a part of me, from my accent to my style, or lack thereof, to my lingering sense of being just slightly left of center. The Five Towns is where I found my two great loves, shoes and golf. I'm not a very good athlete, but I've always loved sports. In high school, I didn't make the school's basketball team, so I played on an intramural team just for fun. I was probably the worst player on the team, but I enjoyed it, and it gave me an outlet for my restless energy. When I was growing up, the Five Towns was a prototypical Jewish suburb, but one of those five towns, Inwood, was home to mostly Black, Italian, and Irish Catholic families. The neighborhoods were essentially segregated, as much of the country was back then, but our high school was mixed. Before basketball season started, I heard that a group of black guys had been kicked off the varsity team for smoking weed or some other bullshit reason. I'd been friends with those guys since we were kids. They were unbelievably talented athletes who worked hard. Watching them play basketball was like seeing Mikhail Baryshnikov dance. Beautiful. It was a no-brainer to ask them to join the intramural team. With the help of our new teammates, we dominated throughout the season and went from one of the worst teams in the league to facing off in the championship game. It was obvious that for us to win, those guys needed as much playtime as possible. So I benched myself and watched with excitement, cheering them on as they masterfully won the game. When it was time to announce the MVP, I wondered which of our star players would be named. They were all so good. It would be hard to choose. Instead, they called my name. My first thought was that it had to be a mistake. How could I be the most valuable player when I hadn't even played in the game? But then I realized that it was a mistake. They called my name. My first thought was that it had to be a mistake. How could I be the most valuable player when I hadn't even played in the game? But then I realized that it had to be a mistake. How could I be the most valuable player when I hadn't even played in the game? As I accepted the trophy in a state of shock, I realized that they were giving me credit for seeing the potential in others and giving their talents a platform. I was the most valuable member because I had put the team together and then stayed out of the way, allowing them to shine. Fast forward almost 45 years later, and I realized that I had won this visionary award for doing the exact same thing. For 30 years, in between designing and selling shoes and disrupting the fashion industry, I've been building a team at Steve Madden that is the best in the business. Yes, I've taught and coached them, but I've also been incredibly lucky to surround myself with hardworking, talented people. I never hired based on a specific skill set or kind of experience. My approach is more that of a coach, in particular Gil Brandt of the Dallas Cowboys, who is famous for making unconventional draft choices based on a player's potential. When I find someone I trust, someone I know who will be a good partner, I find a role to fit the person, instead of trying to force someone into a specific position. Then the trick is to let go. The entrepreneur is a control freak and a perfectionist, and the truth is, I probably wouldn't have let go if my hand hadn't been forced right at the height of my career when I was sentenced to 41 months in prison. At that point, I had no choice but to shore up my team, put my faith in them, and step aside. The results speak for themselves, and the irony is that I'm still winning championships by keeping myself out of the game. It's been a long road from the intramural championship to the Visionary Award. Now people speak about my accomplishments in the past tense. How did you do it? I know what they're asking. How did I build this brand from nothing and go from childhood screw-up to convict to someone who's being showered with awards? The answer is deceptively simple. I put things together, whether they're shoes, teams, or the disjointed pieces of my life. Jordan Belfort, the infamous Wolf of Wall Street, first called me the Cobbler back when we were friends, as he took my company public and invited me to work with him on other deals too. And while that relationship represents one of the biggest mistakes of my life, one that led to a painful downfall, I have to admit that the name he gave me fits in more ways than Jordan ever could have known. Jordan called me the Cobbler simply because I was obsessed with shoes. But to me it means so much more than that. A cobbler puts the various pieces of a shoe together, the upper, the lower, the lining, and so on. But a real shoe guy knows that shoes are made of more than just raw materials. The inspiration behind the style is just as important and includes references pulled from music, pop culture, and whatever else is going on in the zeitgeist. The result is a shoe that's not just comfortable and well-made, but that says something about the person who is wearing it. I got a thrill out of pulling these various pieces together to create my most iconic styles, from the Maryland to the Marylou, the Slinky, and more recently, the Trooper. But I've used the same techniques to piece together a team of mostly outsiders. Hires that make no sense individually, but that are amazingly effective together. And though it's hard to separate the company from my life, that's been pieced together too. And thanks to my kids and friends and the people I love, it's now mostly whole. So which one am I? The egomaniac, the trend spotter, the entrepreneur, or the visionary? What about the family man? Honestly, they're all true. I'm the same flawed person I've always been. In fact, the more successful I've become, the less sure of anything I have grown. When I was young and just starting out, I thought I had all the answers. Hard work and money were all that mattered. Success at all costs would be worth it. Now I'm not so sure. I have money, I have success, and I've paid for it by losing years of my life and people I loved. Was it worth it? My answer is an unequivocal yes. It may sound like an overstatement, but if I could go back, I wouldn't change a moment, even the time I spent in prison, thinking my life was over. Whether it's a shoe or a life, without each piece carefully stitched together, the final product will never be the same. But I want you to read my story and tell me what you think. What would you have done differently? My success may or may not be an illusion, but the hustle, the hard work, and the cost it took me to get here could not have been more real. It was a wild ride. Maybe you'll learn something. If not, I'm pretty sure you'll be entertained. All I can promise is to hold nothing back as I cobble the pieces of my story together. 01. Seat. Seat, where the heel of the foot sits in the shoe. It normally matches the shape of the heel for comfort and support. Growing up, I always felt like an outsider. The kids I went to school with were almost all from the same type of upper-middle-class Jewish families. But I was different. My dad was Irish Catholic and from the other side of the tracks, while my mother was a local Jewish girl. I was the only mixed, half-Jewish kid to be found. This isn't rare today. My kids go to school and everyone's half-Jewish, but it was incredibly rare back then. The folks from my father's neighborhood of Inwood, with its small lots and squat, modest houses, were the cabbies and bartenders who served the wealthier residents of the other neighborhoods. Those towns were filled with grander homes on wider, tree-lined streets. Our house was relatively modest, with a nice-sized yard on the side where my brothers and I played football, and a smaller yard in the back where my mother kept a tomato garden. There wasn't a lot of tension between the folks in Inwood and the rest of the 5 towns, but there wasn't much mixing either. I grew up in the 1960s and 70s, the height of the civil rights era, and crossing that line was still considered risque. Jewish kids didn't hang out with the kids from Inwood. Dating or marrying across the line was basically unheard of, except for my parents. This meant there was nobody else in my neighborhood like me. I was a complete anomaly, but it didn't bother me. In fact, I reveled in it. I didn't have to pay much of a price for my differences. They weren't big enough for me to be ostracized, just for a friend's mom to look at me sideways every once in a while. For the most part, I was free to enjoy my outsider status. It gave me the freedom to be whoever I wanted. There was no mold for me to try to fit into. It would have been impossible for me to be like the Jewish kids I hung out with, or like the kids from Inwood. So I pulled from the people around me and cobbled together those disparate elements to become my own person. As a kid, I idolized my dad. Now, long after he's passed, I'm more fascinated by him. Much of his family worked in the Catholic Church, and he left all that behind to assimilate into a Jewish family and lifestyle. He even partnered up with other Jewish guys to run a little textile company, Abbott Fabrics, and he was the most Irish Catholic-looking dude around, tall and distinguished with a full head of silver hair. He looked like a Supreme Court justice, not a schnorrer working in the garment district. But nonetheless, there he was. My dad was already 44 and my mom was 36 when I was born, the youngest of 3 boys. My parents had grown up during the Depression and were in their 20s during World War II. They knew what it was like to lose everything, including family members who went off to war and never came back. My friends' parents were only kids during World War II. They were born into a period of great hope and optimism, rather than one of the darkest times in our country. I could feel this difference when I visited my friends' homes. The air felt lighter, breezier, hugs and compliments were given out more freely, and money flowed more liberally, too. Being exposed to such a wide range of generations affected me in ways I wouldn't fully understand until I was much older. When it came to my business, I've always had an old-school blue-collar mentality. From day one, my team and I were scrappy and worked on a shoestring, pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps, if you will. This I learned from my father, but I paired that old-fashioned work ethic with a hip, forward-thinking approach to the design and marketing of my shoes. This aspect of the business was influenced by both my older brother's generation and my own, and later by the young men and women I hired to help marry the past with the future. My father worked hard, but the textile business was tough. He never made the big bucks, and the overall feeling in my house when I was a kid was that we might lose everything at any moment. Every weekend my father would sit me down and read me the bankruptcy notices in the newspaper. "Look at what is happening in this country," he would tell me. Looking back, I don't think we were really that close to going broke. We certainly weren't rich, but we weren't poor either. I had a bike, but never a Schwinn like most of my friends in town. The 5 towns was an economically competitive place, and we struggled to keep up with our neighbors. My dad worked hard, though, and earned enough to buy a Cadillac and to play golf on the weekends. Golf was his respite, and I inferred that he had to play golf in the weekends to have the energy to work so hard during the week. Even with these small comforts, my parents had been so traumatized by what they'd seen during the Depression that they lived in constant fear of poverty. There was a lot of fear in our house, fear of the floor falling out from beneath us, and fear of my father's temper. He was the center of our world, and his mood dictated exactly what went on in my family. If he was in a good mood, things were great. He'd take me to a football game and sing the national anthem at the top of his lungs. It embarrassed the hell out of me, but a part of me secretly loved it. If he was in a bad mood, though, look out. My dad was something of an egomaniac. He drank too much and he was hard on me, but he was a good man. I may have judged my father harshly when I was younger, but now I see him for what he was. A poor boy who never went to college, who was cut off from his family, and who worked like a dog to provide for his kids. He taught me my single most valuable business lesson, and that is, first things first. You have to take care of the fundamentals, putting food on the table, paying your bills, before anything else. He lived by that rule, and from the moment I started my business, I have too. I realize I haven't said much about my mother, and that's because my childhood was my father's show, not hers. As a little boy, the time I spent with her revolved around my dad. Every evening we'd drive to the train station to pick him up after a long day of work. There was no need for him to call my mom to tell her when to leave the house. He took the same train every night. I remember sitting in the back seat of our Cadillac, eagerly waiting to see him walk off the train in his long coat and hat. Looking back, I can see that my mother had a creative side of her own. We had a piano in the house, and she would hear a song on the radio, jump on the piano, and pick out the notes herself, playing it by ear. It was incredible. But between my father's moods and managing 3 boys, she didn't have much chance to pursue her own interests. This was, unfortunately, the case for many women of her generation. Unlike my friends' moms, though, mine wasn't at all a typical overbearing Jewish mother. In fact, she showed little interest in me. I don't know if this was because I was the 3rd kid or because she didn't particularly care for me. I recognize now that she loved me, but it was clear to me from a young age that my mom didn't really like me, and I can't entirely blame her. I was a hyper-skinny little loudmouth kid who was always getting into trouble, and my mom had no patience for it. My grandmother on my mother's side, who lived with us for a while, would say in Yiddish that I had spilkus, a nervous energy, or an inability to sit still. Everyone else just said I was a pain in the ass. At school, I got in trouble for constantly speaking out of turn, for tapping my hands on the desk, and for being a class clown. I was impulsive, and I couldn't stop my mouth from interrupting the teacher or making a wisecrack, even if I tried. At home, I was just as loud and obnoxious, a smartass. My mom couldn't stand me, but my dad tolerated me a bit more. Maybe this was because I tried to tone it down around him, ever wary of his mood. I only succeeded sometimes. Nobody imagined that I had some sort of attention deficit or learning disorder. There was no such thing back then, really. You were either a good kid or a bad one, and I was definitely the latter. As I absorbed the disappointment of my mother and my teachers, I made a caricature out of myself. It wasn't a conscious decision, but I had been written the role of troublemaker, and I played right into it. I broke the rules and acted obnoxiously, just to prove them right. There was a moment that this flipped, but that came much later, around the time I started the business. At that point, the same urge to act out mutated into an intense work ethic, an obsessive drive to succeed at all costs in order to prove them wrong. Unfortunately, it took decades of screwing up before I could make this shift. As a kid, there were 2 times I could focus, when I was reading and when I was playing golf. I never did well in school, but I was an avid reader, and I especially loved biographies of movie moguls like Louis B. Mayer and Samuel Goldwyn. There was something about the intersection of art and commerce that intrigued me even then. These guys were interested in the whole vision of a project from beginning to end. They were businessmen like my father, who went to the office in a suit and tie every day, but they were also artists. That was a completely new concept to me. I was fascinated to read about the guy who made Gone with the Wind. He wasn't the director. He didn't write the screenplay. He wasn't an actor. His name was David O. Selznick, and he was the executive producer. That's who I wanted to be, the person who put all the pieces of a project together. But in my house, there was no value placed on being creative. If someone went to an easel and painted, they were creative. But who cared? Hard work was what mattered, not creativity. Now I know that creativity encompasses so much more than just making art. It's an ability to lead, to hustle, to see around corners and predict future trends and problems, and yes, to create as well. As a kid, it wouldn't even have occurred to me to think of myself as creative, and I still have days when I wonder if I really am. At the same time, I can see now that my artistic spirit made me sensitive to the environment around me and able to take in so much stimuli. Besides my dad, I absorbed the most from my 2 older brothers. John was 11 years older than me, and Luke was 3 years younger than John. This meant by the time I was 7 years old, I was practically an only child. John left for college, and Luke was cutting class and flunking out of high school, so my parents sent him off to boarding school. My dad was in his 50s by then, and he and my mom seemed ready to be finished with the hard work of parenting. They'd already been doing it for so long. I was left to my own devices much of the time. On the weekends, I rode my bike all over town with my friends, and over the summer, they sent me to sleepaway camp. It was at camp that I started to use my full field of vision and natural awareness of the people around me. I could see clearly who could use a pick-me-up and who was feeling invisible and needed me to throw a little attention their way. The summer I was 10, we took popularity votes every night in our bunk. Don't ask me why. In the morning, I'd choose someone who seemed like he needed a boost and spend the day trying to help him get voted the most popular. Can you believe how Bobby landed that volleyball serve? I'd asked the group of kids as we roasted hot dogs over a bonfire. He really helped us to win that one. Of course, building up the people around me was also my way of making sure I was liked myself. This was something that mattered to me more than I would have admitted or even been able to understand. During the school year, I played baseball or basketball with my friends every day after school. I spent much of that time doing the same things I did at camp, emphasizing other people's talents and making the rest of the team feel good. On the weekends, I golfed with my dad. That was our thing, and thanks to my dad, golf became a huge part of my life. It was also the one sport I really excelled at. I wish I could remember what my dad and I talked about while we golfed. Probably not much, really, but I do remember how strict he was about making sure I raked the bunker after we took our shots. Overall, he wasn't a strict father. He drilled his work ethic into me and then left me to figure out the rest for myself. But if I ever forgot to rake the bunker, forget it. He'd totally lose it on me, and our golf game would be ruined. Now, every time I rake the bunker, I feel like I'm having a little moment with my dad. Once in a while, my dad would take me to work with him in Manhattan. We'd board the train in Long Island, and when we got out at Penn Station, boom! We were in another world. I loved it. There were businessmen in suits like my dad running to catch their trains, shoeshine guys calling out to us, and a newsstand run by an old blind man. I remember giving him change for the newspaper. He could tell right away how much money I'd given him, just by the feel of the coins. I watched in awe one day as he cursed at a guy who had given him a penny instead of a quarter, trying to stiff him on the paper. Then we'd exit the train station on 34th Street and walk up to the garment district. It was a rush. There were people and noise and colors everywhere, a perfect replica of the chaos in my mind. At age 10, I vowed to live in the city one day. I hardly remember a time when I lived in the same house as my brothers, but that doesn't mean they had any less of an influence on me. I got a dual education from my parents on one side and my brothers on the other. John and Luke were very different from each other. At least that seemed to be the case back then. John was simply the coolest guy ever, and I idolized him just as much, if not more, than my dad. He was unbelievably charismatic and handsome, impeccably dressed, and had an innate ability to charm everyone he met. The guys all loved him, the girls went nuts for him, and he was a nice guy on top of it, too. I worshipped him, and I wasn't alone. Everybody in the 5 towns thought Johnny Madden was a god, and it was a boon for me to be able to walk into a room and have everyone know I was his little brother. While John was charming and sophisticated, Luke was fully immersed in the hippie counterculture, and I don't mean that he just wore bell-bottoms and smelled like patchouli. There were people who were influenced by hippies, and then there were the hippies themselves. Luke was the real deal. When I was 11 or 12, he left college and moved to a commune in Baltimore. The next time we saw him, he was unrecognizable. Not just the way he looked, but the way he acted and talked, his whole demeanor. It was all peace, love, drugs, and long hair. It wasn't my thing, but I thought it was cool. My parents, though, just looked at him like it was an alien, a freak. I loved both my brothers, despite or perhaps because of their differences. From John I took the value of charm and likability, but I soaked in Luke's whole vibe, too. The music, the fashion, the free spirit, and the focus on love and acceptance were all beautiful to me. I was younger and more a part of the Alex P. Keaton generation, but I was shaped by all of it. My trademark penny loafers and long, flowing, strawberry blonde hair became symbols of my dual influences, my 2 older brothers. As the years passed, though, it turned out that John, Luke, and I had more in common than any of us would have expected. Each of us faced our only slightly different battle as part of the same larger war with alcoholism and addiction. It's a tough fight, one you can never really win outright. The sad truth is that to some extent both my brothers lost their battles. I'm still fighting mine a day at a time. If you had seen John at the age of 20 or even 30, you never would imagine he'd end up the way he did. He was like an idealized image of a man come to life, and I have often asked myself why I couldn't be more like him. But his addictions ate away at him slowly, not fully taking hold until he hit middle age. It kills me that his kids never really had a chance to know him when he was younger. He was the best father he could be, and I know how much his kids loved him, but he was a completely different person by the time they were old enough to remember. Luke's path may have been easier to predict in some ways because of the hippie thing, but like John, his alcoholism didn't take over his life until much later, long after the commune and Woodstock were in the history books. Then, despite our family efforts to help, he fell prey to his disease too. I'm not judging either of my brothers. I still battle this demon every single day. In a way, it's a blessing that I fell into the clutches of drugs instead of alcohol, because they took me out much quicker than booze alone might have. I was a full decade younger than either John or Luke when I hit bottom, and I knew that I had to get clean or forfeit the entire war. Where did it come from, this tendency, or genetic disease, or whatever you want to call it? I often revisit my memories, looking for answers. Growing up, alcohol was ever present in our home. It was never really a problem, but it can't be a coincidence that my father's 3 sons all turned out to be addicts. He definitely liked to drink, probably too much. Like many men of his generation, he enjoyed his martini lunches, but he always functioned, worked hard, and never made a public scene. No matter what, he was on that same train every night. In all the times I spent with my dad on the golf course, I don't remember seeing a bottle. But when I was 13, I was able to get a junior membership to the golf club, which meant I started playing less with my dad and more with my buddies. Did things get worse after that? Was my father hiding an addiction that fueled his temper and dictated his mood swings and his severe views on life? I'll never know. The next year, when I was 14, I started working as a caddy at the golf course. For 5 hours a day, I carried 2 huge bags that each felt like they were bigger than me. And for that, I earned $14. It was dreadful. Sometimes I caddied for my dad, but I always wished that I was playing with him instead. The one thing I liked about the job was the opportunity to be around other men my dad's age. I always loved listening to them talk about business and politics and the news of the day. I found myself uniquely situated to take in the message from the older generation to work hard and the opposite ideology from the younger generation to opt out. I've done both, and this duality has shaped my life and my business. In high school, it seemed like I was headed more in the direction of opting out. I started cutting class and smoking pot with my crew of buddies pretty much every day. We were like the Rat Pack. Alan, Dean, Brian, Barry, Danny, and me, we skipped school to play golf and smoke pot, often at the same time. In high school, Brian Frank nicknamed me Fogman because I was always thinking about 1,000 things at once. I was also stoned most of the time. I remember walking down the hallway of our school. It was loud and bustling with other kids, heading every which way. Brian was talking to me about something. I could barely hear him because I was too busy juggling so many other thoughts. To me, it felt like it was out of nowhere when he screamed, "Yo, Fogman!" and finally got my attention. For a moment, anyway. I was awkward and scattered, and the fake confidence I used to hide my insecurities often came off as cockiness, which turned off a lot of people. At least I had enough confidence to jump when I saw an opportunity. When I was 16, I overheard my friend Jeff Meltzer talking about how he was up for a job at a shoe store called Toulouse in downtown Cedarhurst near all the shops and restaurants. It sounded a lot better than busting my ass caddying for $14 a day. Plus, I knew that store. The owner, Lance Rubin, had gone to school with my brother John. This is one of those times when being his little brother really helped me out. I knew that if I went in there and told Lance who I was, he'd probably give me the job over Jeff, and he did. Lance was cool. He was only 27, and he owned the store and dabbled in designing shoes too. This was a guy, like the movie moguls I'd always loved reading about, who combined artistry with commerce in an interesting way. He made no bones about being creative. Lance was also a painter and was really an artist at heart, but he was also a businessman, and in this case, a businessman who looked nothing like those movie moguls or like our fathers. It was 1975, and the fashion industry had just barely started paying attention to young people. Members of the hippie generation were now in their 20s and had their own unique sense of style. Boutiques like Toulouse with posters on the wall and...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?